Thank you very much for coming, Paddy.
Thanks very much indeed, Tony, for welcoming me and for introducing this further workshop on this very fascinating work, which is now 35 years old. And every time you read it, I think you find something different, something new coming out of it. And so it's a great opportunity to try to develop it further. In the workshop on the shaping of modern secondary education, which we had in November, my presentation on England took the opportunity to foreground this work. It was published in 1987, particularly the themes of segmentation and systematization, developed by Detlef Müller and Fritz Ringer. Today, just to set a bit of an agenda, if I may, I'd like to pursue the background to this edited volume, 35 years on, and particularly the role played by Professor Brian Simon in helping to put it together. And I wanted to argue that Simon's conversation was principally involving his academic leadership of the project in helping to put together this groundbreaking initiative in international collaboration, which has set the framework, the tone for so much that's happened since. But on the other hand, intellectually, Simon seems to have been somewhat detached, I think, from many of the ideas put forward. And I suggest that this may have been due to an ambivalent relationship which he had, which there was between Simon himself and the French social theorist Pierre Bourdieu, as well as because of the distractions which were caused by the conservative educational reforms of the 1980s. He spent so much energy in resisting. The origins of the volume go back more than 10 years. The UK History of Education Society was formed in 1967, and Simon soon became its chairman. He was particularly interested to try to engage internationally with colleagues overseas. And he wrote informally to many colleagues to try to ask for support for what he saw could be an international seminar on the history of education, which he felt was much overdue. There was a positive response to this, and the Society agreed to organize an international symposium, a conference which was developed on the relations between education and society, particularly with regard to social structure and educational provision and demography and literacy, and all on the 19th century. The conference duly took place at Westminster College in Oxford in September 1978. And the following year, in September 79, there was a further conference held in Louvain in Belgium. And it was this conference that agreed to establish an international standing conference in the history of education, ISHE, the origins of ISHE itself, taking place at Louvain. And this conference elected Brian Simon as the first chairman of the new society from 1979 to 1982, and its first constitution. So Simon, a key figure and in a really great position to help to organize this international collaboration. At the same time, Simon was visited by Professor Müller from Ruhr University. Now, he had recently published a very large study of over 800 pages on the social structure and social changes in Germany in the 19th century. And according to Müller, his own analysis of the stratification of education at the time paralleled the analysis that Simon had made in volume 2 of his multi-volume history of education in England, which covered the period 1870 to 1920. That volume, it discussed the relationship between education and the labour movement over that time in the development of the education system in education in England during that period. So it seemed to fit. But Müller was always also working with the social theorist Pierre Bourdieu in France. at that same time on the relationship between education crisis and social dimensions developments at that time. Simon noted in his notes on the meeting that both Muller and Bourdieu were very keen on historical comparative studies and wanted him to be involved, and he was quite happy to be involved. They agreed to develop a seminar, which would be in Germany, Bochum, in 1978, 1979. Simon said he would be interested to take part, but he insisted that he himself would not be able to do any further research on the later 19th century. He himself had moved on to the 20th century work. This discussion was also influenced at the time by the work of Professor Fritz Ringer, whose masterwork, Education and Society in Modern Europe, was published in 1979. Ringer described this both as serving as a temporary foundation for a young field of study, the comparative social history of national systems, and argued that it was crucial for education systems to be studied from both historical and comparative points of view. These interactions led then to the international seminar held in 1979 at Ruhr, organized by Muller, under the auspices of a research project on knowledge and society in the 19th century. And that led on to a further conference, one at Leicester and again one in Bochum, to plan for production of the volume 1987, which we're all familiar with. Now, there are several English colleagues who were involved in the conferences, and this was a very new thing for them. They were already starting to get used to discussing with colleagues in the United States. There had been people appointed to posts in Canada, Australia, even far off New Zealand. But as one of the delegates in Bochum at these conferences put it, Roy Lowe, who's still working today, he said that this blew their mind, being involved in these new ideas from the continent, and this really, over the longer term, this Roy Lowe says this really influences thinking about education and society. So Simon had a key role in putting all this together, and I think that mustn't be underrated. But what was his intellectual contribution? This, I think, is less easy for us to discern. In 1980, he had formally retired from his position as a professor at Leicester University, and he was now in a position to complete his multi-volume history of education in Britain. He was already preparing the fourth and final volume in the late 1970s. And his surviving notes, which we could find in the IOE archive, show that he'd had ambitions to try to complete this, even at that time, and really very ambitious ideas. And they show as well that he was very used to the ideas, first of all, of Bourdieu, and secondly, of the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci. And it was the competition between the ideas of these theorists that I think we need to understand Simon's own view. Simon was sympathetic to the views of Gramsci, partly because his brother was a leading popularizer of Gramsci's ideas in England. Simon himself was very optimistic, very positive in his views about the possibilities for educational change over time. And he saw this potentially also in Gramsci's ideas. But he was also very, very critical of the views of many other sociologists at the time, particularly the new sociology, which had developed from the early 1970s. He clashed with Michael F.D. Young of the Institute of Education, who was the architect of the new sociology. And Pierre Bourdieu was associated with new sociology, partly through his translated chapter, which appeared in the volume Knowledge and Control, which has appeared in 1971. And it was from that time, I think, that Simon started to get a rather suspicious attitude towards Bourdieu's ideas, seeing him as part of this movement towards social reproduction, and a less positive attitude towards the possibilities for educational change. And I think that it's this ambivalence that we see at the heart of his somewhat restrained attitude towards the intellectual ideas of the conference. Simon said himself that modern educational systems are an area where the changes in education are contested between different social groups, and what's going to happen is something which will happen in each case, in each instance. You can see his ideas coming through particularly well in his edited volume, Does Education Matter? In 1985, and Simon said, yes, education really does matter in changing society. So as opposed to Bourdieu's ideas, Simon took a shine to Gramsci's views, which had been translated into English in the 1970s. But there was also another factor in Simon's international development which came into play, and that was his involvement in contemporary educational and political debates. Simon's work was based creatively on a synergy between his historical research and his involvement in current debates. This had drawn him into debate, for example, on IQ testing in the 1950s and comprehensive schools. In the 1980s, they drew him so much into resistance to the Conservatives' educational reforms, led to the Education Reform Act, that he was actually distracted from his work in the history until after the act was actually brought in, and so he felt that he wasn't really able to take a very strong part in thinking about the ideas. So if you see, for example, later on in the final volume, which came out in 1991, the final volume of his History of Education, he does refer to both Bourdieu and Gramsci, but Gramsci is seen more positively than Bourdieu in these terms. But both of them, he had not really had any time to develop any new kind of thinking about what he thought about them. So, what's the implications of these developments for there we are, Simon and Bourdieu, that's Bourdieu, and Gramsci, and Does Education Matter? And by 1988, Simon was eventually thinking that he'd done all he could about educational reform. So there were several English contributors to that final volume, as well as to the conferences. But they seemed to be having a separate conversation to what was going on with the ideas about segmentation and the like, which Muller and Ring were doing. And so you seem to have two different kind of conversations. The English having a conversation among themselves, and the Continentals having a very rich theoretical discussion. It didn't seem to come together in any great kind of way. Indeed, if you read Simon's chapter, he actually is talking mainly about the period 1850 to 1870, which was the topic of his first volume, let alone his second volume. His ideas about the moment of change between 1850 and 1870 had really been discussing in the 1950s. So he was really refusing to take part in the discussion which was going on between Muller and Ringer, which is really quite curious. And so there's a lot more that needs to be done to fill out and to do the hard intellectual theoretical work, which Simon really hadn't had time, nor had he had the intellectual taste to develop himself, to really try to develop the comparative aspects between education and social change during this period, 1870 to 1920, which is really a gap in that in that important volume. And even now, 35 years later, we still need to develop more fully the relationship between Gramsci, Bourdieu, and educational change in relation to the English context, which can bring out these comparative aspects. All this work really needs to be done over the next generation, one would hope, and one waits to see whether that can happen. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Gary, and thank you very much for keeping the time. So it's the time to questions and for discussion. Is there anyone who wants to ask something? Hector, Alicia, Felicitas. People from the online.
If I could advertise as well, a new book that's due to come out in July. 3rd of July is its mooted publication date. The first full-length volume on Brian Simon's ideas, which Tony Canales, Jenny Koo, and myself have co-authored. Brian Simon and the Struggle for Education. UCL Press, open access. And I hope that will be of interest in relation to all these debates about Simon's contribution.
Okay, thanks.
Hello, Gary, this is Conan. I don't know if you can hear me. Would I be able to ask a question about this comparative aspect and how you see this next generation developing relationship between education and social change?
Building or putting this international seminar and getting connected with Mueller and Ringer, but at the same time, you said that he did not have the taste for the comparative aspect that Mueller and Ringer were trying to or were looking for. So what took him in the end to participate in this project of following seminars? And
yeah, he felt strategically that it was very important to get international collaboration together, that this was very important for the field of history of education, that they mustn't stand apart as national systems. That this would be very, very important. And so in terms of leadership and strategy, you know, this was very much in accord with his own ideas. What seems to be the problem was the intellectual direction in which these were moving. Unlike his own ideas, which emphasise the possibility for educational change, that education could change society, even if only on the longer term, that despite any setbacks, one could still come back and improve things and change things in a radical way. These sociologists, in his view, were really against that kind of view. They seem to be taking the view that education was more a stone wall, that it led to social reproduction, the reproduction of inequalities, rather than the possibilities for educational change. And he was very worried about that in general terms. And he took a dislike, a firm dislike to many of the theorists of the time. Others like Althusser as well, his ideas about the ideological and state apparatus. In America as well, Bowles and Gintis calling capitalist America, which he saw as their correspondence theory, a very rigid view of that there's a correspondence between inequalities and society created by the economy. And others in the States as well. So he felt that the direction of sociological theory was mainly in that direction. As I say, he saw Gramsci as an exception, partly because of his personal connections, and his interpretation of Gramsci was that this allowed for much more movement, and so he preferred to, if he was being kind to sociologists, he would he would say nice things about Gramsci. But even then, he didn't go into any great depth, and I think it would be a mistake to say that he was a great Gramscian theorist. I don't think he took it that far at all. It's a mistake indeed, I think, just to see Simon as a strong philosopher. I don't think he was. He was always willing to engage with interesting ideas, and he's took on many during his long career. But they were mainly to support his own basic kinds of views, which he'd originally started with in the 1930s and 1940s.
That's the point.
Yeah.
Any question from the online? Any question here? Yeah, Simonetta, sorry.
Can I ask a quick question about the IQ testing? I wanted to ask you about Simon's position and if there has been more studies from a historical point of view in history of education about IQ testing and the selection in schools.
Yes. There have been some. There was a very good paper in a 2004 collection in the Journal History of Education on his attitude towards IQ testing. In Simon's own archive at the Institute of Education, you do see some of the debates coming out, including within the Communist Party itself, about IQ testing, because initially there'd been a strong view that IQ testing was part of the science of education, and that therefore it should be supported. But Simon argued very strongly against that. And we've got some work in the coming volume, which talks about some of these debates as well in the 50s and 60s.
So I go with a comment. I don't know if I'm wrong, and if you agree with me that I have the feeling that Simon was more interested in doing historical research than in theory. That he, in the field of theory, he was a little bit flying, not sailing, no? Yes. Because, for example, here in this book, in page 19.3, he has a paradigmatic paragraph about how turning, about this kind of things, are living it, because he started with the idea that infrastructure superstructure determination cannot be is good for revolution, but cannot be used in other fields. And then Bourdieu into brackets, but only into brackets.
That's right.
And then he goes on and say, yes, there is the educational system has autonomy, but at the end, behind that, there are the classes, the interest of classes. So Marxism is still interesting. Finnish and grammar schools in England, blah, 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 blah. So this kind of a gap between the theoretical and the really the historical research, which is what he wanted to do. I think. I don't know if I'm wrong.
No, I agree with that. So thank you, Tony. And I think you can see that coming out in his notes about his histories in the archive in London. Quite often he would reflect on what he's trying to do in each of the volumes and what he's trying to argue, which is really an interesting example of the historian's craft. You can see that coming through very well. And on this particular occasion, his notes on 14th of September 1977, he starts to talk about how he wanted his fourth volume to come out in very intriguing kinds of ways. If I could quote from that a bit more length, perhaps. Well, partly he talks about Bourdieu, but the way he puts it is very strange. The Bourdieu thesis, question mark, he's really not quite sure how to handle this at all. And then he goes on to Gramsci and he gives him one question mark. Again, how to build up his ideas. Where have I got this? See if I can find this. I'll get a chance to write this up. I'll say a bit more about this. But before this, even in 1969, Michael F.D. Young, who was a new sociologist, his work coming through at the Institute at that time, they had quite a heated discussion about a draft paper that Young had written, and Simon took exception to his views about this, and again that started to set in train these intellectual tensions. More broadly, I think you can see these as tensions between sociology and history of education. While there's been quite a lot of literature which has been, and quite rightly, looking towards as a synergy between sociology and history, you can point to many examples where they've clashed, where there's differences of approach between them, which has prevented that kind of alliance. And so that brings us back to Tony's point, which is that Simon was principally a historian, a self-taught historian, it should be said. He never got a PhD in history, for example. He taught himself all of his history. Not an original thinker in philosophical terms. I think that would be fair to say, and able to engage with sociological thinking, but from his own point of view about social change over the longer term. That's where he wanted to frame it. And so all of this stuff about all of this material about segmentation and whatever, the way in which was being put was very alien to him, and he seems to, so far as I can see, completely turned off and withdrew from that conversation.
There is a question of Maria. Maria?
Oh, hello. Thank you very
Hello.
much, Harry. Very interesting. I
No
just
sound.
wondered.
No sounds?
Can you hear me?
You must put your micro.
I think it's on.
No. Again?
No.
No.
No, we can't get you.
Just one moment. Francisco, Paco, can you speak a little bit just to check that the problem is not with us?
The problem should be with you because I can hear her perfectly. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
I don't hear you, Paco. Either.
No.
I'm talking, and
No.
Maria is talking.
No.
Yes, I can hear you,
I can hear
Francisco.
Maria.
Sorry, give us a moment. No, mira, abajo, Felicitas, en la esquina derecha abajo está el sonido quitado.
Shall I write?
¿Ves que está ahí? Ábrelo. No, abre. No. Habla, Paco.
Hello? Can you
Sí,
hear me?
hola.
Okay, really.
Ahora sí.
So, Maria, please. Thank you, Paco. Maria, speak.
Okay.
Okay.
It's okay? Oh,
Yes.
muy bien. My question actually to Gary is, I just wondered whether Simon had any contact with the English social theorist Margaret Archer and critical realism. And I'm just thinking, Archer's Social Origin of Educational Systems came out in 1969. And that was based on her postdoctoral research that she did in Paris. Now, I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think she was working with Bourdieu at the time.
That's a very interesting point. I don't have any evidence on that. I'm not seeing anything in this work. And of course, there are a lot of other comparativists, specialist comparativists at the Institute of Education in the 60s and 70s. And so there could have been more but sometimes I can see that didn't quite happen either. If you look at some of the work of Bob Cohen, for example, he would make the point that there was a separation between them. Now, there was some work that came through in the late 1980s from the comparativists. Well, he wasn't at the institute, he wrote it, but and his work on education and state formation is a classic historical comparative work on the development of state systems of education in different countries, and he develops a good relationship with Simon, and that is a good example of comparative work. But so there are other people around, but it's the people who developed an explicitly sociological approach that seem to be the issue here, more than the self-styled comparativists. And here again, I think we see the compartmentalization of educational studies. It's a wide range of different kinds of areas, rather than the kind of interdisciplinary kind of study, which it might have been.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions from the public online? From the table?
I see, is Tom still there? Tom Woodin, my colleague of his, I think I saw him earlier.
So if I may do, yes, a comment, maybe you agree with me, Gary. I think that the main problem here is that the sociological look, the way of approaching the questions of sociologists are not the historians one. So right. I think that especially in the case of Bourdieu, on all these, even Margaret Thatcher, all these functionalist sociologists, they are very interested in fitting the pieces in an engine who is running and running and running. But when everything is running and running, turning once and again, the problem is how to explain historical change.
Yes.
If all the pieces fit, why does the engine work in another way than expected? And I think at the end, Brian Simon was a historian, so it's inside this framework, it is impossible historical change. No, where does the change come from? I don't know if you agree. So it is a question of mental structure, no, a question of traditions approach.
Yeah. Yes, I'd see this book as a very important formative document in the development of comparative historical studies. But fundamentally, that there's a fracture running through the heart of it between the pragmatic social historians of the English type, which you find in part 2. There's several contributions there. Look at Steedman, Reader, Honey, and Lowe on what's called structural change and social reproduction in England. None of which really engage with rigors and Buller's ideas, and the sociological theories which are developing based on Bourdieu, developing them further through Rigor and Muller, and so in thinking about how to build on this work, one might want to take them into directions which different countries might lead us towards. There's a very limited number of countries, of course, included in this, but also trying to think about how to engage more fully between the social history and the sociology camps which are represented here.
Okay. So we have still some minutes to this Gary's presentation. Any question? I think that if not, we can save time then, and then thank you very much, Gary, for this presentation. We go to the next. Is I'm not wrong, it is Felicitas, no? Felicitas Acosta from you must just 2 minutes for preparing the PowerPoint, and then I start the presentation of Felicitas.
Mi presentación está acá.
Está en el escritorio. Cierra.
No, no me aparece.
No, abajo, pica abajo. No, aquí. Mira a ver aquí. No está bien. Te digo, pica aquí. Vale. Ábrela.
¿Cuál es?
Pica en el escritorio. Pica aquí.
Sí, pero
No, ya lo voy a hacer. Esto es más fácil así. Es que no me queda. Sí. No se puede minimizar. Oh, bueno, pues vamos al escritorio. Pues está, ¿no? Ok. Y ahora tú. Desde aquí. Aceptar, ¿no?
Sí. Pero no lo veo acá.
Ya. Vuelve, cierra esto y vuelve a. ¿Ahora sí?
Sí.
Now, can you see the presentation? Maria, can you see the presentation or Paco?
Yes.
Sí, se ve, se ve.
Thank you very much.
We can see it, we can see it.
Okay, thank you very much. So we continue with the presentation of Felicitas Acosta, who comes from the Universidad Nacional General Sarmiento from Argentina, and also the Universidad Nacional de La Plata. Felicitas, thank you for coming, and thank you for inspiring this meeting. So is your turn, is your time. Go on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, well, we are all here together. We are all here together again to discuss around the topic of secondary education, and in particular this seminal and exciting book. I would like first to thank Tony for putting together the project in which this seminar or workshop is framed, and to the colleagues here. And I think this is also a relevant opportunity for our standing working group in ISHI, and I'm sure these discussions may encourage other colleagues to join us in our standing working group. So regarding my presentation, finding an angle from which to approach the revision of the concept of systematization was challenging. And I say this because when one reads Mueller's work here in the book, the concept itself and the definition seems to be simple and easy to transfer because it is formulated in a very high degree of generalization. But throughout the book, the concept of systematization receives various criticisms and comments that lead us to think about the usefulness of the concept in the end. So mainly what I propose here is to reread Mueller's work and how in particular Ringer and Stittman take up the concept. I think Hilary Stittman does take up the concept in a particular way, but also the critiques it receives from Alisetti and Harney. I will not detail this because other colleagues will do so, but what I would say is it's very hard to find, to give an account of the scope and limits of the concept of systematization without referencing to the books, other chapters and authors. So that's in essence what I'm gonna try to do. Yeah. Okay. So to review and reread the concept of systematization, I will organize the presentation in 4 parts. In the first part, I will briefly describe some characteristics of the context of production of the concept of systematization, in particular in relation to the field of the history of education, not as Gary well presented in the context of the seminars or the book itself. Secondly, I will go back to the definition of the concept of systematization proposed by the author, and what I understand are his assumptions or the assumptions underlying this concept. In the third part, I will focus on the necessary interaction with other concepts in the book, such as segmentation and defining institutions. And I will try to think about the limits of the notion of systematization. And finally, I will refer to a case I have already shared with you, which is the development of secondary education in Argentina. But I think there are some things that may illustrate some of the preceding reflections on the concept of systematization. So as regards the context, I think it's important to point out some very general features of the moment in the development of the history of education as a discipline in which this concept and this book is located. So following Harosh, the moment encompasses the emergence of what he calls a new history of education, but also its pitfalls. So for example, it was a moment of, after the 60s or by the end of the 60s, it was a moment where there was a look at educational institutions and processes in what he calls a self-consciously radical way, but at the same time, there was a sharp politicization of scholarship, transforming many arguments into historical dogmatics. And I think a bit of this is related with what Gary wrote about Simon's reaction against some reading from the theory of reproduction. In this context also, the new research in history of education shifted attention from the development of pedagogical ideas to the relationship between education and society. And this was new and this was a renewal. But what Harosh points out is that at the same time, these continual invocations of society opened the door to what he calls an ideological reductionism, which assumed causes and effects before they were proven. And this is kind of a critique that can be found to the concept of systematization in the book as well. He also says that much of the new work used social science concepts, and history of education became more quantitative. And of course, this is shown in Mueller's and Ringer's work. But sometimes he warns that this indiscriminate borrowing from the social sciences often served as window dressing for masses of what he calls indigestible figures. So there is a lot of figures, but again, not many proofs or not many explanation and reflections around those figures. And finally, he says that Harosh says that this reorientation of the history of education was an international process. And it took place first in the United States and then and later in Europe. But by the mid 1980s, this initial excitement has been abated, and education was no longer in the forefront of discussion in social or cultural history. So I wanted I think it's interesting to understand that the book was a product of these tensions that were in a way framing the discussions on history of education. So the concept of systematization is produced in the context of this wave of revitalization of studies in the history of education from the 1970s onwards, but also in the framework of a growing awareness of the limits that this revitalization presented. And in fact, Harosh himself, on this piece citing, which is about the history of education in Germany, is quite critical about Müller's formulations and even the notions advanced by Ringer in the book we are analyzing. So the concept of systematization, there is one more note regarding the context of production in studies on the history of education that I would like to point out. And this came from reviewing other works, not precisely contemporary, but close. Works that by that time were concerned with the question of educational systems, their formation and their relationship with other social systems. And in this sense, and Maria well brought this question about Margaret Archer, I think that the work of Margaret Archer, who in some sections of her writings raises points that coincided with the perspective that Müller and Ringer in particular are trying to develop. However, her work is not taken up in this book, which calls my attention particularly in Müller, who strengthens the need to depart from a definition of the education system. So here in the slide we can see the definition of education system that Müller provides and the definition that Margaret Archer has built like a few years before. And they, I mean, Müller does not cite Margaret Archer, he shouldn't have to, but they are talking about the same in a quite contemporary, I would say, or in yes, in the same context, but there don't seem to be connections there. And I think it's interesting to complement Müller's ideas with Archer, because Archer sets at least two main questions concerning education systems, which resonates with the book we are analyzing. The first question is when she thinks about education and education systems, she asks where they come from and how they work. And where they come from and how they work is historically connected. And so this emphasis that Archer proposes when studying the education systems, I think in a way is connected to the concept of systematization, which tries to explain how education systems are formed and how they work. But also, Margaret Archer, when studying education systems, poses another two interesting issues. She talks about the mechanisms of institutionalization, and she talks about which parcel of the struggle for educational control is institutionalized. So she poses these questions of who won, who lost in that struggle, and also the extent of the defeat. So in a sense, she is not only talking about these mechanisms that the concept of systematization allows to describe, but she's also wondering about the struggles that underlie these mechanisms of institutionalization. And she proposes this morphogenetic cycles theory, which could serve to a better understanding of educational systems. But this theory is not cited in the when the concept of systematization is developed. So this really caught my attention because it's quite contemporary. It's in the same field of discussion, but there doesn't seem to be connections there. So regarding the concept of systematization, well, you have all read the book, so I will not go into detail there. But I think that, and picking up on what Gary was presenting about the context of the book, it's important to say that Müller frames his development in the search for a comparative analysis in the history of education. And I think this point of departure is important because he's looking for theories or he's looking for analytical models that will lead to a comparison. And he's very critical about the way in which comparison in the history of education has taken place, because it was about comparing or confronting school forms or pedagogical discussions, which would only provide an overview of different national structures, but as he says, cannot offer new hypotheses or adequately specific research results. So he's looking for an analytical model for comparative, for a comparative history of education and to compare education systems. And he also departs from the concept of segmentation developed by Ringer in 1979, because he understands it is a concept which makes comparative historical analysis possible, although he's not going to focus on the concept of segmentation. So he warns that he takes Ringer's perspective as a starting point, but he will try to focus on the conditions in which the educational system originates and develops, and on the impact of changes within the system and upon the structure of society. So we have the definition, and it's mainly based on the idea of interinstitutional articulation, and he proposes these three phases in the development of education systems: emergent, constitution, and complementation. One interesting issue around the concept of systematization is that these phases, in a way, seem to be quite rigid from Müller's perspective, because he points out that the fundamental organizational and structural principles, as well as functional classification distinctions, are laid down in the phase of system constitution. Müller uses this conceptual development to analyze one case, which is the case of the education system in Prussia. And he will distinguish these three phases to propose that during the phase of system formation, an existing multifunctional school, which he calls comprehensive or comprehensive in character, will be replaced by processes of vertical differentiation. And here's where he connects with the concept of segmentation. And I think the best synthesis for what Müller achieves with this concept is formulated by Ringer in the introduction, when he says that as a consequence of this change that Müller analyzes, the system thus created was a social hierarchical one, and the whole process of systematization was also a conflict-ridden exercise in social demarcation. And so here is the relationship with Ringer's perspective and the concept of segmentation. In his introduction to the book, Ringer sees the concept of systematization in complementarity with that of segmentation and what he calls the generalist shift. And I agree with this assessment if the aim is to describe and explain the process of formation of educational systems, because the concept of systematization in itself, it's not, I would say, explanatory. And it is really strengthened in its articulation with the notion of segmentation and, in my opinion, with the notion of defining institutions as Hilary's statement proposes. And here I would pick on also the work of Antonio Viñao, who in 2002 puts together all this conceptual framework and proposes the idea of a dynamic configuration of education systems. So he speaks about the systematization as a process of connecting diverse institutional offers, which is always linked to segmentation, understood as the existence of trajectories that are differentiated both in terms of curricula and the social origins of the students. I would say that the result of this dynamic in terms of Viñao is the production of institutional differentiation, which is a concept that Ringer mentions but does not develop. And this institutional differentiation can be regulated explicitly, for example, through the standardization processes developed by the state, and this is what the concept of systematization is mainly focusing on, but also the Ringer's idea of the generalistic shift through the orientation of curricula is an example of standardization. But this institutional differentiation can also be regulated implicitly by, for example, positioning institutions that lead a process of modeling. And that is the case of the defining institution that Hilary Stidman proposes in her chapter. So what is the explanatory potential of the concept of defining institution, and why do I think that it's really connected and it's really important to, I would say, strengthen the explanatory capacity of the systematization concept? Hilary Stidman proposes this notion for the English case, and she focuses on the power of institutions to establish domination, not only through types of knowledge, but also through distinctive school and organizational features. And she has a kind of discussion with Ringer, because she says it's not so much about the generalist shift, but taking a look at the power of institutions to establish dominance, not only by means of type of knowledge, but also by means of school approach and organization. So the concept of defining institutions refers to those institutions, in her case, were the public schools, that acted as an authority in secondary education, and that therefore became the frame of reference for secondary education institutions that try to approach them. And I think this is a very interesting complement to the concept of systematization, because in a sense, it shows a bit of the dynamic that it's not only established by administrative and standardized norms, but also about how different institutions play out when or during the process of organization of secondary education. I think that also, in addition to complementing the concept of systematization with that of segmentation and the general shift, Ringer has differences with Mueller's analysis that are also worth noting. One of them refers to the simultaneous and interactive tension between exclusion and expansion. And I think, in a sense, Ringer and Mueller have different positions towards sociological theory and the work of the theories of reproduction in general. Because what we can see here in Ringer's terms is that, of course, there was a dynamic of exclusion, as Mueller will note, but he found that there was also a process of expansion in the non-elite or modern sector. And so this encouraged him to think that there was probably not social mobility, but that doesn't mean that there was only exclusion during the formation or in the structuring of secondary education. So I think this tension that he mentions between exclusion and expansion is very relevant to understand the dynamic of the configuration of education systems. The other difference between Mueller, between Ringer and Mueller, is linked to this dynamic of exclusion and expansion, but I would say from the point of view of the cultural package in Archer's terms, that is in the end institutionalized. From Mueller's perspective, systematization was a process of modernization centered on the hierarchical structuring of a class-divided society at the time of industrialization. So that's why he sees it as a process of modernization. But at the same time, from Ringer's perspective, segmentation accounts for what he calls the activation of traditional meanings in the nascent modern education systems. So to the aforementioned tension between exclusion and expansion, following Ringer, we could add the tension between renewal and concept or to express it in historical categories, I would say changes and continuities. What this tension is showing is changes and continuities. And this also appears in Margaret Archer's work. So this is why I find it so relevant to connect it with this book. Some of the problems I see around the concept of systematization, which derive from
Não estão me ouvindo. Mas eles não estão me ouvindo.
River and Harnick's critique.
Nem eles vão deixar você ver a imagem.
Careful, someone has the micro open.
Yeah. Okay.
Someone in the public.
So Luis here and Carlos will refer in this workshop to Aldisetti's and Schrewer's and Harnick's critique. But taking up some of their approaches, in particular Schrewer's and Harnick's comment, I would point out at least 3 issues. The first point to note concerns to the use of the term system. Mueller's intention was to account for the origin and development of education systems. But we could wonder, in line with Schrewer and Harney, how much of this of his work refers ultimately to the system and how much refers to the organization of secondary education. And I find it, when I reread Mueller's work, I find it hard to see if he's really talking about the configuration of the education system, or is he only talking about secondary education and the process of organizing secondary education. And he uses he seems to be talking of both things at the same time, but this to me is not so clear. And this situation can also be found in Ringer's introduction. So maybe it seems that it was easier to locate temporally the structuring of secondary education or part of it than the configuration of education systems, which is harder to locate temporarily, because when one says, and this is one of the critiques that the concept of systematization receives from Aldisetti, when can we talk about the existence of education? When can we say it started and when it ended? So in a way, there is a difficulty there. I would say that maybe this is kind of an overimpression of categories that we can find in many history of education classic books to classify educational practices. These categories sometimes refer to the notion of system, even when the education system did not exist. If we take a look at classic history of education, such as Maurice Davies and Gaston Mielaret or Marou, they classify the educational institutions in primary, secondary, and higher education, which did not exist by that time. So I think this is a kind of a trend maybe in history of education at some point. Another issue that I think is problematic with the concept of systematization is connected to what I have just said, is a certain presentism in the use of terms, which can lead to confusion. And this can be seen when Mueller uses the term comprehensive to refer to the character of the gymnasium prior to the phase of the constitution of the system. Because evidently the term refers to an institutional model that spread later in Europe, and so it produces a confusion if he is talking about the gymnasium as a comprehensive kind of institution. And the third issue that I think is also problematic refers to the role of the state in the systematization process. Mueller rightly warns against overestimating the place of the state as a determining factor in the form that education systems take. However, much of his argument about the 3 phases of education systems formation rest or rely on the process of standardization, which tends to function as an intermediate category. But this standardization is directly associated with administrative regulation and increased bureaucratic rationalization by the state apparatus. So it's hard not to think that the state has an overwhelming presence in the process of configuration. For example, later works, as Gary was mentioning, the work of Andy Green, but also Weiborg or Troller, Popelix, and Lavery, they all agree on the central place of the state in the formation of education systems. And alongside this and beyond Mueller's scope, of course, the case, if we take a look at the case of the overseas colonies, which formed their education systems together with the nation state, then it's really hard to imagine a process of systematization without the qualifier state. So this is why I prefer to talk about state systematization, because it's really difficult to understand this process as separate. And I think I don't have more time, right?
A little bit more if you need, but.
Okay, just to mention, and I'm not going to go over this, but I work with this idea of the state systematization and following also the notion provided both by Ringer, the generalist shift, but also the notion of defining institutions by Hilary Stidman. I think in particularly of the process of systematization of the Argentine secondary education and the, I would say, the Argentine education system as a process of state modeling systematization. What I mean with this is that the system was, in a sense, formed in a dynamic of state systematization by modeling, operated at first through the institutional model of a particular kind of school, the national school, which served as a reference for provincial and for private schools. And then this modeling took place through the unification of different offers in common cycles, which follow a process of increasing generalization in the subjects of the curricula. And this practice of modeling was also followed, or can be also seen between industrial and commercial schools, and this generalist shift trend that we can find that Ringer described. But this process, in the case of Argentina, took, like, I would say 60 or 70 years. So, and this is related also to the temporal dimension that Mueller uses when he formulates the concept of systematization. In a sense, we are talking of processes that take between 70 and 80 years. So I would say more like midterm. There is like kind of a midterm duration of these processes in the formation and the systematization of education systems that maybe that it could explain why is it so hard to locate this temporality, to say when did the education system started and when this formation ended, because even in this space of constitution, we are talking of a process of between 70 and 80 years, then it is hard to tell, well, this was the year or the decade when the structural main issues were implanted. And this is also a difficulty I found with the book when they said that the structural change took place like in 20 years. And when we take a look at other cases, it's hard to tell. It was only 20 years, with probably more. So just to, I will not go into this, just to close. I think that in the case of the Argentina and the national schools, and the state modeling systematization process. It also allows to think about how different institutions were, especially institutions connected to universities, were allowed to keep some specific distinctions of cultural hierarchy, like the teaching of Latin. So that brings me back to the question of Margaret Atwood, which is which cultural package is institutionalized and how? And I think this is the question that, in a sense, Mueller is trying to answer without citing the author. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felicitas. Thank you very much. So, questions? Luis, can you? No. Okay, perfect. Any questions? Gary? Okay.
Well, thank you for that, Felicitas. Very thoughtful, very, very interesting discussion there. I think that one of the other contributions to the work is also very interesting as in forming a critique of systematization, and that comes from the American author Albersetti, and he at the end of his discussion he brings in the point which other historians have started to make in the 1970s and 1980s, which is about gender, which Muller and Ringer are uncomfortable with, don't really discuss very much. And so that might be an issue there. But then also that brings in the wide range of other kinds of issues which historians have started to talk about in the last 20 years or so. Ethnicity as being a key issue in the development of systems, issues about citizenship, which again, there's a very interesting collection that's been recently produced on the role of citizenship in the formation of education systems. And so I think we're now in a better position to be able to start from these different kinds of literatures to build on these ideas as well. But I think you bring out the tensions and the problems underlying this categorization in very lucid terms indeed. Thank you very much for that.
We have a little bit time to another question, if there is some question from the public or from the table. Any comment, Felicitas, you want to do?
No, I was looking for, because I think that Mueller, because both Mueller and Simon replied in the book to, especially to Albicedes and Schreier and Harney's critique. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Mueller, of course, he does not talk about gender or incorporate this dimension, but he does mention, and I think he brings this back when he's replying Albicetti, that in a sense girls' gymnasium were only incorporated at the beginning of the 20th century, and they were in a sense incorporated to the boys' mainstream gymnasiums. So I think that what he's trying to say is that to discuss with Albicetti is that it wouldn't make a difference in terms of institutional configuration, because the mainstream gymnasium was not altered. It was just that annexing the girls to the boys' institution. But of course, he's not discussing what you are raising, Gary, that is the issue of gender in general. And I think the work of Helmut Kalbe, he does look into the weight, the significant the significant weight of women's incorporation during the 20th century to secondary education and then to university, and how this, of course, has effect on produces changes in social structure and social mobility. I agree that this is not an issue taken by Mueller. And I think it's interesting to consider how these categories that were built at a certain moment and to understand, I would say, a particular moment or specific moment of the configuration of education system can complement with these new or more newer categories such or dimensions, I would say, as ethnicity or citizenship. And we could think of many others. And I mean, if we're trying here to think, well, what is the use of these categories, not only for the expansion during the 60s, but nowadays also, then I think this is useful to think in the direction that you mentioned.
So if you don't mind, we stop here. We are going to make a break of 25 minutes. We come back at 11:50, and I'm ready. No, I think no. Oh.
No, correct.
Yes, 11:50. I'm very happy because we are on time. We are keeping the time. So 25 minutes. We come back. Okay, thank you very much.
Ahora ya
Vale, cierro el micro.
corre, sí, vale, perfecto. Y corre, ¿verdad? ¿Has visto que corre? ¿Sí? Corre, ¿verdad? La presentación.
No veo que se mueva.
¿Se mueve? ¿No la ves?
No veo que se mueva, ¿no?
Vale, ya estamos con este problema, como siempre. A ver. Uso compartido. Déjame hacer una cosa.
Antonio, es mejor dejar de compartir.
Ahora, a ver, ahora has salido de la presentación, del modo presentación.
Salido, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Vale, y ahora vuelvo, a ver, voy a compartir esto y ahora vuelvo a compartir.
De momento no se comparte.
Comparte.
De momento no.
A ver, mira, dejar de compartir. Vale, ya está, ya ahora no comparto nada, ¿vale?
Venga.
Y ahora voy a compartir la pantalla otra vez. ¿La ves ahora?
Se empieza a compartir, o sea, todavía estás en formato de no presentación.
Vale, sí, un momento. Un momento. Ahora está.
En formato presentación. Sí, ahora sí está pasando, sí. Adelante entonces, sí.
Perfecto. Bueno, we are waiting for the ladies. And then... One moment. ¿Qué pasa?
So we will continue. So we continue, and that time I wouldn't present myself. So I'm Tony Canales from the University of Complutense of Madrid, and I will speak about the concept of segmentation in Ringer books. This concept was presented in 1979 in the book Education and Society, which is a very well-known book, and it was defined as the subdivision of educational systems into parallel school or programs that differ both in their curriculum and in the social origins of their students. Ringer said that there was a vertical and an horizontal segmentation, and also he had that it was the outstanding feature between 1870 and 1920 of the national educative systems. So the concept was set in the peak of the success of the social history of the 70s, which in educational history gave rise to seminal books, works such as those of Michael Katz in 1971, and also Margaret Archer, which has been named by Felicitas in 1979. Archer's one rather from a sociological approach more than historical, but anyway, social history or historical sociology doesn't matter. In any case, these works share as background the theoretical framework that we could call structural functional in its different versions or dimensions. For historians of education, the central question in this framework was to give an answer to the paradox of the remarkable dysfunction between the education system of the 19th century and the structural needs of the capitalist industrial economy. At a time of unprecedented industrialization and technical development, the victorious capitalist bourgeoisie seemed to be bound hand and foot in education to the classicist tradition of the ancien regime. From a functionalistic perspective, it was obvious that there was a problem here. It was needed to look for a logic that allows the parts to fit together again to unravel the true function of education, since most of the specialists accepted that there was no direct reflection of the class structure. So it was not direct, so it was needed to find the way to link infrastructure and superstructure. No? This was the atmosphere and the language in which Ringer was inserted, presenting a sophisticated formulation far removed from economicist reductionism. He understood that education had its own logic and that it certainly could not be reduced to the needs of economic development. However, it could be understood as a mechanism of class reproduction. And here he went to the theoretical umbrella to do it, the theory of Bourdieu and Passeron that allowed to give education a function and overcome the initial moment of panic. So things are again, the pieces are again congruent. Thus, Ringer's starting point was the incongruence during the first half of the 19th century between the educational system and the social class structure. He pointed out that cultural capital and economic capital were independent and that there was a situation of relative independence of the educational system from economy. Education was the domain of self-perpetuating merit middle classes, since there were no social promotion at that moment. However, the important change took place in 1970 onwards. In this new phase, a process of segmentation developed, which reached its peaks of rigidity in 1930s. In this period, the structure of the education system no longer accounted for subtle variation in prestige and status, but the segmentation acted as an element of legitimation and perpetuation of the social differences between classes. So the system established upper, middle and lower classes, which were delimited thanks to the national educational system. Finally, the adjustment has taken place, all the pieces fit together. Thus, Steedman, in his contribution, pointed out that Ringer understood education as the process of converting social hierarchies into academic hierarchies. Herein lies, in my opinion, one of the problems with this concept. Then also expresses in form of academic programs of curricula, segmentation was closely linked to social classes, not to educational phenomena. In fact, Ringer argued that segmentation included not only curricula, but also other elements that imply differences in status and prestige, such as private or boarding schools. Herein lies, in my opinion, one of the main problems with the concept, because in this extended version, what is then the difference between social inequality or the class component of education? To me personally, the potential of the concept seems to be much greater in its narrow version as a concept associated with the social background of different educational curricula or educative tracks. If it is about class, it is not surprising that the concept appealed to a masses like Brian Simon. In his contribution, Brian Simon openly acknowledged the autonomy of the educational system. He argued that the superstructure infrastructure dependency characteristic of Marxism was generally useful for revolutions, but there was no linear or direct relationship in the case of education. Actually, he stood against economicist models that seek to vulgarize Marxism. In fact, analyzing the English system, Simon was, in my opinion, the one who had the most accurate insight of the real and practical implications of segmentation. On the English reforms of mid-19th century, he stated, the result was not so much that of ensuring the reproduction of society with a divided social structure as the actual reinforcement and more precise refinement of an hierarchical society in which each stratum knew was educated for and accepted its place. However, Simon felt himself too free, flying alone too high, and quickly saw the shadow of a theoretical framework. Thus, he turned to Bourdieu and his theory of reproduction, but in its more functionalistic version. According to Simon, when he's speaking about Bourdieu, he says that according to Bourdieu, education would have apparent, of course, autonomy with respect to the state and social classes, and this is interesting, so that it ensures more efficiently its function of securing social reproduction. And at this point, we find a paradigmatic example of the paranoid metaphysics of functionalism. There is, according to this framework, there is an instance that control education to fulfill its structural function outside not only the consciousness of individuals, but also of the state and the ruling class themselves. So who is directing the process? Who hidden evil? Who is behind all that? Who is behind the individuals, the state, the ruling classes? So I think we are facing with metaphysical idealism, and what is worse, with the radical denial of human agency, since neither individuals, not the ruling classes, not even the state, count. But the idealistic background of the functionalist approach does not end here. There is also in Ringer a remarkable idealization of the industrial economy and its social needs. First, there is an idealization of the behavior of capitalist industrial bourgeoisie, who theoretically was expected to be interested in educating their children in scientific and technical curriculum. I don't know why, because they expected that they run their businesses, or I don't know, when actually
this sector was more interested in adorning them with the classical tradition and ennobling them. Whence this assumption? Where does this axioma comes from? Why do we establish the expected behavior and not the actual behavior? This was the main problem with Ringer, the thing he wanted to explain. No? And there was also a remarkable idealization in the very economic structure of advanced industrial societies. Ringer seemed to understand that the incongruence between the educational system and the economic structure of society arise from the persistence in much of the 19th century of a literate middle class that dominates the educational system, but which is basically ancien regime social classes. So they were a remain of the previous period, and they were called to be disappeared when the industrialization came. However, when the industry became really dominant, these middle classes seemed destined to disappear, and then the segmentation became congruent. However, congruent how? With which classes? No, because the problem is that in late industrialization certainly simplified the social structure at the base, did away with traditional social categories of ancien regime and replaced them with the working class, wage earners, no? The modern industrial working class. But above this class, the main feature of this phase was the expansion of non-manual service sectors, an expansion that Ringer himself acknowledged, a proliferation of clerks, technicians, teachers, consistent with the complexity of advanced industrial economy and the development of the state. Significantly, once again, the shaping of these all sectors was intimately linked to education, also in the late industrial phase of capitalism. I believe that with all this, we are now in a position to make a leap and reformulate the concept of segmentation. First of all, we need to look at both sides of the coin. You don't have to be an activist of the cultural term to realize that education system not only reproduces, but also produces social classes. Secondly, we must abandon the functionalist metaphysics to highlight human agency, not functionalist needs. Individuals act in relation to the education system, usually collectively, and their action can be taken into account directly as intentional, but also as unintended, unexpected outcomes. I recall John Elster when he stated that history is the fruit of human action, not of human intention, which is quite different. From here, we can reconstruct the process of segmentation. Undoubtedly, it contains defensive strategies, not structural, but usually intentional, of social groups that wish to preserve their privileges without needing any hidden evil to direct or control them. They knew perfectly what they wanted and what they were doing. And they often had the help of well-meaning people, usually educationalists, who helped them in this selective objective by pretending the opposite. This is the unexpected effects of human actions. No? And in the other hand, we have social groups that were produced by the educational system, not by status or prestige, but by diplomas. And I think that on this point, the approach of the classical book, the book we are discussing, is insufficient. In my opinion, is too Anglo-Saxon, a perspective that does not give diplomas the importance that they have in the whole continent, reducing diplomas as a kind of German mania, and it's not. Segmented education directly produces occupational groups and thus social groups that soon acquire their own distinctive elements by diplomas. Clerks, technicians, lower, middle, and upper civil servants, teachers, a growing caution between bourgeoisie and proletarian, to which everyone wanted to belong in the 20s and in the 30s. This is a key issue for us. At least in continental Europe, education became the main mechanism for social promotion in economic terms. Earning more than your parents meant having a diploma and working in that protected and regulated space to which the diploma gave access. This did not escape Ringer, who pointed out that in the 30s, segmentation became more rigid and ever, precisely to defend the privilege against the newcomers. We can complement the picture with the advocates of the suppression of modulation of segmentation in such a way as to contribute to social equality. To summarize, I think that the concept is still useful if we reformulate in the following way. In a restricted version, restricted linked to educational phenomena, not to any kind of social inequality. In a non-functionalistic framework, we have to highlight human agency, and we have to complete it with the inclusion of pedagogical ideas. We cannot, and Ringer did not, reduce pedagogical ideas to class interest. Behind them, there are social and class projects, of course, but also an structured knowledge that claims to be disciplinary. So we have the pedagogy. We cannot reduce pedagogy to class. And finally, it is necessary the inclusion of the two major tracks or programs that have been left out of consideration all along the book and that constitute the great challenges to the 20th century: teacher training and vocational training. So in the 20th century, segmentation is about that, not anymore about technical, scientific, and so. With all this, we can save the concept of segmentation theoretically. Another question is whether it is useful in practice for the analysis of the history of education in the 20th century. Because I think Ringer was right, segmentation reaches its peak in the 30s after the great debate between traditionalists and advocates of comprehensive education, which was resolved with the absolute victory of the traditionalists, of the former. Nothing was done in the interwar period in Europe about comprehensivity. But from this point onwards, another reverse process started, which is not anymore segmentation, but the contrary. We have to speak from the 30s about desegmentation, or rather better, the segmentation is a boutade, no? I mean, it's better to speak about organic integration. It started a new process of organic integration. This is a question, and I have 3 minutes. I want to explore in Budapest, but let me outline it very briefly. Everybody talk about Germany, but if we want a paradigmatic example of segmentation, we have to look at Austria in the interwar period. This is segmentation. The socialists proposed to overcome this with a typical comprehensive reform that would simplify everything. And we have accepted that the transition between segmentation and comprehensivity goes through that way. But it's not true. This is not the way. Don't forget that it finished with nothing. There was no result of this. And what I propose is to look at a more specific process, which is not so ideological, but much more technical and organic, which is the integration, organic integration of the system, overcoming segmentation in the lower secondary school. And to understand it, we have to go to Italy, of course. If we go to Italy and we go to the typical segmentation of the Gentile reform, Simonetta will correct me if I make a mistake here, but you see 4 ways, no? 3 and 1 without any continuity. And then talking about against comprehensivity, but for technical, organic, and even also political reasons. Botai in 1939, the fascist Carta della Scuola, created a Scuola Media Unica with a single exam of entrance and a single exam of exit. I think this is the way. to understand comprehensivity in Southern Europe and also in France, because, of course, this is, and then the following, no? This is a compromise. This Escuela Media Única includes Latin because it's secondary education. It's not comprehensive, it's not for everybody. Most of the people, of the children stay in the Corso Integrativo, but we have a first embryo of the Escuela Media, which will come later. So, and I think the same happened in Spain, even in a so single and simple system like Spain. So we had the only universitarian, single universitarian secondary school of Francoism, but in 1933, a reform was set which created the elemental lower secondary education with an exam, finish exam, exit exam, which allowed to continue to the university, of course, but also to go to work, but also to integrate organically teacher training and technical schools. I think that even in France, we can find something like that with the Carcopino reform of 1941 with Vichy, which created a time which tried to suppress the continuing schools, Republican, the École Primaire Supérieure, and wanting to make more selective the system, actually did the contrary. I have to study it, I don't understand very well, but it created the Collège Moderne, which will be the embryo also of the future reform after the war. So my idea is that we have to look at this organic integration, this process of organic integration, which is not openly comprehensivity, but means to overcome the process of segmentation. Thank you very much. Okay. Any question?
Not pose any question because I'm going to review the concept. So otherwise, but
any comment? Ideas?
Yeah, well, if I may, and again, I think that's a very, very helpful, very insightful discussion there of the limitations of the concept and the ways in which we can still build on it. I'm struck by the section in Simon's article on systematization and segmentation, the case of England, in which he talks about education having, from the English experience, a large degree of autonomy from the economic base, political and social forces involved in restructuring and systematization rather than economic. And so you're really saying equally the segmentation is this political, social forces which are really fundamental here as well. And I think that's very persuasive indeed. I like the way you're bringing Italy and Spain into the conversation as well. I think that's really important. And again, if we're thinking about ways of developing a new set of articles which builds on this, I think, again, that's going to be really important to help to take that forward. So I think, that's really, really interesting.
Okay, thank you very much. It's not very much I have to answer to.
No, that's great.
I like it very much, Tony. Thank you very much. And also, you touched a lot of relevant points. But for instance, one about the unwanted effects.
This is very interesting. Unintentional.
Yes, I think this is a very, very relevant point because we see many times, for instance, in political reforms, have certain aims, but then they may fail because they don't match what really society wanted. For instance, in Gentile set up a women secondary liceo, which was of a lesser, lower level really, which failed completely because at that point it didn't have any sense. And also about the Botai school that you mentioned. In this case, also in other cases, the role of Latin. I think we'll have to think more about the role of Latin.
Okay.
As being selective. Obviously, it was meant to be selective, but not
so much.
Yes, exactly. For instance, in Italy, after the Second World War, there was a great debate about the role of Latin. Because Botai wanted Latin because Latin belonged to the Italian tradition, because it was fascist and also other Chilean. But for instance, Marchesi, who was professor of classics and he was communist, he advocated the role of Latin as a right for all children, also poor children have the right to learn Latin as well as maths. So it was a big debate. He didn't mean that Latin was selective, but it is potential. So we'll have to think about this. It didn't, not necessarily was selective normally because I mean,
but I don't think it's selective. Why?
Not necessarily. I mean, mathematical.
Math is much more selective.
Yes.
I think you make the point. I mean, for this old functionalistic tradition, Latin is the perfect example of the non-justified assumptions in the discourse. First, they understood that Latin is not useful, so it has to disappear. No. Second, they understand that Latin is more difficult for the poor people than other things. Why? I mean, no. And third, they understood that people wants to have sense in the curriculum, that people wants to study things that are useful, which is ridiculous. We in the South, we study for diplomas, and if we have to study Mandarin Chinese, we do. I mean, nobody is asking why is that useful, no? So, and the case of the Latin is fantastic because the problem is why Latin when it's not useful for an industrial society? Then, in a functionalistic approach, they look for a function. So we have to find a function for the persistence of Latin, and then they find the theory of the social barrier. Latin is, and then everything works. We have the function of Latin. It has the function of avoiding that the working class access, because Latin and working class is so why? I mean, I think it's easier in terms of intentional. So there are people who believe that Latin avoid the poor to come, but it's intentional. They know, they think, they believe that. There are other people who believe Latin is important for everybody, so they keep, no? And then others who think that Latin is important, but unexpected, non-intentional, maybe it is preventing. So it's a good example of how to reconstruct the Latin question, but without going to functionalistic things, no? I think it's very difficult to explain in English, but no, I think you can understand more or less. No?
There is some very good work, I think, on that particular topic about Latin. Christopher Stray, if you've come across his work, has written some very good work on Latin in the 19th and 20th centuries, the public schools and how it moved from being central, really dominance, to a situation in which, although it was marginal, it was still strategic to have Latin, even in the late 20th century. So charts that changed over time. Christopher Stray, really, really good.
Okay. Any other question?
What about the role played by diplomas and certifications at the end of specific cycles of secondary education? I think it's a very important
I think it's a question.
In this segmentation architecture.
I think that in continental Europe, it is the key question. Maybe in America, North America, they cannot understand because you can get a lot of money without a diploma. This is an open economy. We can assume that. But in Europe, the only way of progressing socially is to go to this new space of middle classes. And the condition is education and a diploma. You cannot work in this job, which gives more money than your parents without a diploma. So the diploma is needed. The key question is the diploma and the space it opens. On my question. So the curriculum to get the diploma, which is something that to the Anglo-Saxon tradition consider a lot for us. So you want the diploma, and if doesn't matter what you have to study. Nobody thinks it should be a congruence between the diploma and the training for the diploma. Some pedagogues did that, but the people, doesn't matter. What I want to be is a clerk. What do I need? What I want to be is I don't know, a teacher. What do I need to be that? No, because the only way to get to work, to have a job in this new space is education. So all the space is shaped by education. So diplomas are fundamentals, no? And we are still here in our cases of faculties of education. We are discussing about diplomas because every diploma opens a niche, a space of work. No? And this is the question. No? I think diplomas, I think that the book of Miller, Ringer, and Simon doesn't give the importance it had to diplomas. Because even in the 19th century, I mean, these middle classes of ancien regime, but
Ya,
they do.
perdona que te mande este mensaje, pero la hija de una amiga está haciendo magisterio en la UNED y tiene que hacer las prácticas. Le dicen que se tiene que meter en el programa Prado, darse de alta, pero no sabe, no se ha enterado cómo funciona ese tema en la UNED. Si ella tiene que buscar un centro de práctica, si hay un abanico de centros.
Yeah, it was Gabriela. No, well, the importance of diplomas, yes, because the importance of professions, because even at the end of the 18th century, there were lawyers, there were doctors, no? There were, I mean, it's not just these middle classes love to be educated, it's that they did works, no? I don't know. Yeah. So, any other quick question, because I'm finishing.
I have a quick one.
Maria,
can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh.
Okay. Yeah, it's just going back to Brian Simon. Brian Simon, in his work, makes a lot of reference to studies of children's cognitive development. And I just wondered, in the research on the development of educational systems, the theoretical thinking, does that come into it anywhere, sort of consideration of how understanding of children's development might then inform educational systems?
So I'm not sure to have understood. Could you translate to
Studies about
Shall I say it again?
No. They are translating to me.
Sí, en el estudio de los sistemas educativos, porque Brian Simon sí toma, por ejemplo, la dimensión de desarrollo cognitivo. Sí, en el estudio de los sistemas educativos esto aparece.
But I don't know. I'm not sure about that, Gary. But I think that in the kind of works, historical works he did in this kind of books, it is not related. I think it is another question in the big debate of the 40s and the 50s against the.
Well, I think you could well develop an argument that psychology is developing as an academic discipline in the late 19th, early 20th century in such a way as to create the image of a science, informing educators' ideas about the capacity of different groups to go into different parts of education, then forming a rationale about selection for secondary education. Works very well for the English case. about grammar schools and all the rest of it. But that general issue about selection within the formation of modern education systems, I think she's absolutely right. You know, it is there, and psychological concepts are at the heart of all of that. So I think, you know, there is certainly a good argument to be made about that. Then I think there is some good literature. But again, you know, one can bring in a lot of the work of the last 20 years or so to really bolster these different kinds of conceptions, you know, to help us, you know, certainly, you know, for the English dynamics of the thing.
Maria, what I know is that Simon was very concerned about psychology, actually, because he thought that IQ tests were the basis of the 11 plus exam and all this, and he was very combative against that. Remember that he was translating Soviet psychology during the 50s. No, he was very critical about that. But what I cannot answer is how he included that into historical analysis. I don't know. But he has a lot of work about that, and he translated. He went to the Soviet Union, and he was working with Lumbia and all these people, and he translated two volumes of Soviet psychology with this idea, because he maintained that Soviet psychology was outside this approach, this technical measurement approach. No, I'm sorry not to be more concrete.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
But I would also add that, at least from the perspective of this book, it is more like a concrete categories, but because what they are trying to look at is at the relationship between school types, university courses of study, and occupational careers. So it's these three things that they are putting together. So other issues that we are raising here, well, it was not in the scope of their analysis. And I think it's the point you are raising, Maria, it's very interesting how this, children development or students development based on educational psychology, how does it enter in this articulation between very concrete things like school types and university courses and occupations. And this is the three things that they are looking at. And as regards your presentation, Tony, just very insightful. I think that we also have to take into account, and Ringer does mention this in the introduction, that they are working with descriptive categories, and they use it in that way. And they try to describe what they consider are actual facts. Ringer says Mueller is describing actual facts. And I think in a way Ringer is trying to do the same with the idea of tracking, because the effect of segmentation is tracks, creating tracks. And they are describing that process. So when we interpret that process, I do think that the concept has a problem, as you mentioned, when he tried to transfer these tracks to the class structure or the organization of the social structure. There is a problem there because I think he may be missing intermediate categories to show how these tracks are in fact connected to the social structure. But they are looking, especially I would say, to like these descriptive issues and so, or categories. So in this sense, I think they are still useful to understand maybe a particular moment. But as you raised, and you will demonstrate it, they probably won't work to describe other moments of expansion of particularly of secondary education. In any case, I'm not, I mean, we will discuss this in Budapest, but I like the idea. I think the idea of desegmentation is attractive, but in the sense, but we have to take a look at tracks and what happens with tracks. in the sense that Ringer postulated,
Mhm.
to talk about desegmentation. Because one thing is to propose a more integrated school, but does it mean there are no tracks? Or
No, yeah, of course, of
okay,
course.
so is it desegmentation or what?
Another kind of
Yeah.
hidden segmentation.
Yes.
Hidden
Yeah.
segmentation.
Could be.
Would be, yes, I know, yes, yes. But anyway, it is a new segmentation. This is another kind of segmentation, of course. I mean, the concept is still useful to look at this. So the internal tracks of comprehensive schools and their social dimension. In this way, it is important. But in the structural sphere, that maybe segmentation finished. No, we don't have anymore the three different schools. What we have is a single structure, and inside it, no, maybe I mean we have to work more about.
But I think maybe the problem is that the concept of segmentation in this book, it's not as broad as in Ringer's book.
No, yes.
Which is broader, because in his definition of segmentation in his book, not in this one, he also includes as an example of segmentation, which is what he calls the limiting case of segmentation, students who are out of school. So he is including these students out of school as a limiting case of segmentation as well. So this is a more broadened definition. And so if we take that definition, which is not exactly the same that he's using here, then our perspective might
But for
change.
me, in my opinion, the problem is that if we go to broader, the concept disappears.
Yeah, because
we are talking
ends up
about
as
social
segmentation.
inequality and education. So if we can say social inequality and education, why to say segmentation? No? I mean that we have to keep a kind of curricular component. Otherwise, that's I have to think about that. But that's my feeling. That we have to keep. It is useful. It is related with curricular tracks, curricular organizations, subjects. Just in private and public, I'm not sure. This is social inequality, no? It's not needed. I don't know. But he other things to say, always in the case that it make a very clear social mark, a way of speaking, or a way of behaving, and maybe in that way it can be useful, no? But I would ask to keep restricted to curricular tracks. I don't know. We can discuss that. We will have time in Budapest to discuss it.
Where you bring in issues about occupations and professionalisation, I think the work of Harold Perkin is useful as well. And he did 3 volumes, again, there's a 3-volume issue about the growth of a professional society in the case of England in the 19th and 20th centuries. That again, you know, is worth bringing into this conversation.
Okay.
You have comments on the chat.
Oh, I have one. Where?
In chat.
Ah, aquí. Maria. Okay. What is that? Okay. I can hear. And this is a question of
No,
Maria.
it wasn't a question. It was just an observation, because this matter of unexpected outcomes had been raised a few times, and I just pulled my copy of Brian Simon from the shelf and just wrote that down, because it's quite interesting, I think, and it's a different train of thinking. That's cool.
You know, he's saying, well, body looks all right until you actually see the historical empirical outcomes, which are often quite different.
Okay.
So he makes that point quite explicitly. So I think that's a helpful point to make.
So thank you very much, Maria. It is a very, very good quotation.
Yes, yes.
I think that we have to finish here and to continue with Luis if we want to keep the time. So thank you very much for your attention. And this is the turn of Luis Grosso Correia from Porto University. Yours.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Good morning to everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this meeting. And I have to end
Abajo, compartir pantalla.
But I want to open my...
Ah, okay.
Todavía no sale.
No, ya lo veo que no.
Yeah. Thank you. I think now it's visible for everyone.
¿Se ve, Paco? ¿Lo ves?
¿Se ve? Que le dé adelante a detrás a ver si funciona.
Yes, run it, just to check.
Sí, perfectamente.
Okay, so once again, good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this meeting, and I thank Antonio Canale Serrano once again for inviting me for this so-called workshop of the Standing Working Group History of Education of Histories of Secondary Education, which are part of the International Standing Conference for the History of Education. So everyone is welcome to this Standing Working Group in Budapest and in the future conferences. What's left of a seminal book 35 years later? This is the motto of this meeting, and I try to grab it the best way it would be possible. Let me first begin to apologize for my English. I'm trying to read my text, but I'm not used to. But under my presentation, it's more written than graphic, so I apologize for that, but the time was running out. So to review the concepts of systematization and segmentation, I try to go further and beyond what James Albisetti and Heinz Hellmar Tenort have stated about that, and just to frame what we're talking about, it's the Fritz Winger, one of the co-authors of co-editors of this volume, says that it was important with Bourdieu to distinguish culture from economic capital, as Felix says, I have touched that perspective too, and it's also to pay attention to symbolic contents of education traditions and social categories and meanings in order to make more visible the account of the cultural reproduction, and of course, and also of the social reproduction and the symbolic domination. This introduction is quite relevant for me because somehow it touches the key points or the key concepts developed by Bourdieu and Jean-Claude Masseron in their seminal works, evidence-based works of Les Héritiers and the reproduction. And a brief concept of systematization, the concept of education system represents various forms of or educational institutions that are interconnected when parts of the system are related to each other and their functions interdefined. Should one have recourse to the concept of the system? And of course, as Felicitas has also highlighted here previously, Miller defined 3 periods in shaping of the Prussian education system: the emergence of the system, the constitution of the system, and the completion of the system. And these 3 phases are quite relevant because the completion of the system is the future. Until nowadays, if we have a systemic approach regarding education, and by the end of these authors, that starts in the mid-19th century. And of course, with Fritz Ringer and segmentation, Fritz Ringer concept of segmentation was not so clear. And this is quite relevant because there are a lot of overlappings between the 2 concepts. What is systematization? What is segmentation? And sometimes it's hard to distinguish them. And I will provide some examples. So segmentation has to do with the organization of the curriculum, for instance, and the dialogue that curriculum makes with the social origins of students, which is on the stake in this book. So James Albisetti, somehow he said that there is the rise of the modern educational system, which is part of the title of the book, involves several implicit assumptions that require clarification. The first one, if it is a process, it is a process that occurring in a period from the rise to an end, and when does it finish? And this is an open question. And the second one, who is the driving force behind this process? And the third question, it is what is the relation between systematization and social reproduction? I think these are the 3 key questions posed by James Albisetti. So regarding the chronicle limits, the systematization process overpassed the 1920s, which is somehow the limit of the reflections provided by the book, and last until the 1960s. And we have a lot of, and they provide a lot of examples from the Prussian or German educational system, or even from the French one. But they say, and even there are some substantially modified systems, but they are not fundamentally changed if we take a careful look on secondary and higher education institutes in Europe. For instance, in France, the secondary reforms of the 1960s will reveal a perfect example of vertical social segmentation. The reform was introduced in 1902 in the lycée curriculum, last for several decades. 3 of the secondary 4 tracks, A, B, C, and D. The D named modern secondary education without Latin. They last until the 1960s. And let me remind, the 1960s were the period when the Bourdieu and Passeron study the field, shaped their theories in this field of the secondary French education, is French secondary education. The Prussian reforms, I say so, in 1900, inherit a well-articulated system that came from the 1960s and caused admiration, even in Portugal, due to its completeness and carefulness. Gymnasium, Real Gymnasium, or the Oberrealschulen that have some modifications in the early 20th century. So let me pose also adding some questions. What is a system? Which are its components? And what are its common properties? And by the hand of some authors that study systems, it could be a system of human communication, but also systems in a broader sense, or the general theory of systems, like Stephen Littlejohn, Daniel Durand, or Jerry Potskar, or Jean-Claude Lugan. It's quite curious because this systemic approach to education was the spirit of the times in the 70s and the 80s. So it's relevant that the authors try to embed in their considerations this systemic approach. And of course, what is a system? A set of elements are related to each other to form a single whole, as we have previously written by Miller's writing. The components, elements, quality of elements, internal relations, but also relations with the surrounding environment. It's not closed, it's an open system. And of course, common properties, totality. And first critic, where is primary education in this book? Where are the girls? Secondary education, they're not there. So interdependence, it's not there also. We're not touching the primary school education, for instance. Self-regulation and control, yes, we can face that very clearly. Even the examinations process I talked here previously. Homeostasis and equilibrium. Systems love evolution, not revolution, because they should have their autonomy, but also the seeds to provide self-organization when the crisis came. So, and of course, interchange with the environment, it's also with the other macro social systems, I think it's very important. So, who is the driving force behind this process? And Albisetti posed the question, is the result of a conscious human agency in regard to segregation of the social classes? And Miller portrays the system as developing itself. And he provides an example that was the propaganda of the so-called overcrowded professions, the qualification crisis in Germany in the late 20th century. And he says maybe it was some kind of conscience and defensive strategy of part of the ruling social classes and the social groups to keep their benefits. It could be rhetorical, but it was a way of defending their somehow privileges. Or another example, but from the middle of the 20th century, that was provided by Troger and Juan Bourboulon in his Histoire du système éducatif français, French one, that it was interesting because the system did not provide pre-primary education. And it was the local population that imposed the pre-primary schools to municipalities because women were going to the employment market and someone should care about children. So it's curious because the system can welcome and integrate these other claims. And of course, educators and about the unexpected outcomes. Educators or political leaders did not consistently achieve their intended goals, which is why Oviseta recommended in 1987 further research in a thorough fashion. Okay, let's talk about this thorough fashion by the hand of different authors. An important issue to this research will be provided by the concepts of school culture, school form and grammar of schooling, and of course school model that Antonio Nova has approached in his doctoral thesis in history in 2006. And school culture, three core ideas by Dominique Jolia. The organization of school space and materials, it's very relevant. Building furniture, specific materials. Why? It's curious because we're talking about the rising or the shaping of educational system in the same periods of the splendor, let's say, of the universal exhibitions worldwide. And those those world those universal exhibitions, education was there, and the technology for schools were there too. So we have to be careful about when we talk about only systems, but also school culture. And also the establishment of a course in separate classes, which one marking a progression in the education ladder, let's say. And of course, the importance of the constitution of a body of professionals specializing in education. This is teachers. We have also to embed teachers in this our reflections. About also school culture, too many ideas by André Chervel. School culture as a result of a set of unexpected effects, and not only of the position between inferior or secondary culture that was adapt or simplify the contents of a superior culture, the university or scientific culture, for instance, but with its own rules or its own specification, aims, official programs, teaching materials, evaluation procedures, and so on. And of course, the history of school subjects and curriculum, or curriculum, besides the so-called more scientific ones, and those types of education and other types of education that could provide moral, civic, intellectual, literacy, aesthetic, rational, and even religions education. And of course, this represents what? To gain the habitus, the school habitus that was touched by Bourdieu, for instance, but also, according to Basil Bernstein, to get or to be embedded in the elaborated code spoken by the school. It's not a common linguistic code. And of course, another concept, school form, and this is curious because Guy Vincent, in his book L'éducation prisonnière de forme scolaire, or scolarisation et socialisation dans les sociétés industrielles, it's quite interesting because in this book, Guy Vincent is talking about the deschooling process that was previous to the systematization of because it was always a negotiation. Maybe children don't need to go to school. Why should they go to school? It's possible to have education in other settings, in other places. So, but reading on the, I don't know the word in English, but reading this perspective with other glasses, we can talk about the school as a form of agency of social forms, because the school form or the school model of socialization dominates socialization from the 19th century ahead. But school was an institution that was contested. And the pedagogical power and the role played by teachers could always be under, could be threatened. And of course, the grammar of schooling. And in a more, not theoretical, but a more descriptive fashion, like Tayak and Torre posed in 1994, the schooling posed itself as a single imagined system for educating children, rendering all other social and institutional alternatives legitimate, and changed the relations between communities and teachers, the school professionals, and the logic of Felicitas touched it. She called it institutionalization, but we can say also it was posed as a bureaucratization, and the increasingly systematic of organic forms of framing students, thanks to a sophisticated system of classification, or segmentation, programming of the curriculum, examinations, and internalization of rules. Students learn the sense of obedience, regularity, and precision. The school habitus. And of course, let me present you what Charles T. Loram wrote about the education machinery, also touched by Mueller, in African settings, because Charles T. Loram, he was somehow a high officer in South Africa in the early 1930s, and imposed it in a very clear way, which was the Western countries' machinery for education in Africa. And I think we have all the settings here of the Western educational systems: financial aid, official supervision, mission educators and or teachers in this case. I'm sorry. Departments of education, corps of inspectors, codes and standards. We are talking about curriculum, syllabi and disseminations, certifications and technologies of the written word, not oral, written word. And of course, classical and experimental pedagogies that was here. There is room for innovation in pedagogy, or should we keep the same traditional procedures? And of course, for the last question posed by Albisetti, what is the relation between systematization and social reproduction? And here, we should pay attention to the social consequences of the educational systematization. And in this point of discussion, we can see the overlapping of between two concepts under revision: systematization and segmentation. Why? Because student social origins are important issue to discuss the increase of inclusiveness and progressiveness, and the decrease of the segmentation as desirable trends. Where, yes, but how to balance, how to achieve this balance between them. And as also Miller posed, Albisetti posed, as long mobility is always too little and segmentation always too great, one does not obtain an adequate picture of what these scholars consider to be the maximum possible desirable or permissive degree of mobility. And in this framework, he says the role of the educational system in social reproduction is an important issue, of course, but has never been achieved by the outcomes of by the recession outcomes. Though Miller, Albisetti invites social historians to consider whether their task should not be to explain the limits of mobility, but, and this is very relevant, what mobilities occurs. And trying to answer to the question on the title of this meeting, what's left of a seminal book 35 years later? And James Albisetti revisited the segmentation issue in his book chapter published in 2019, National Education Systems. And he replies, and somehow he quotes what he has written in this book that is under revision. And he said that Professor Lefter Muller argued, the most controversial thesis about the creation of alternative forms of secondary schooling beside the classic came from professional education Professor Lefter Muller. He argued that in late 19th century Prussia, a permanent structural change took place, the effect which briefly was to replace a system which promotes social mobility and involved educated school children in socially heterogeneous groups and types of schools designed to reproduce specific classes and social groups. So this is the long run, long effect, even in the Albisetti's mindset, that he contests this somehow this perspective of Muller, but he replicated somehow 30-something years after that. On segmentation, it's curious because I will be very brief right now, because time is running, I suppose. Have I overpassed my time?
Yes, I'm afraid, but you have some time. Yes, 5 minutes more?
Thank you.
No problem.
It's
5
too
minutes.
kind. As Ringer has posed the concept of segmentation, Tanner posed the concept of segmentation commits history of education to a specific analytic program and at the same time to broader questions of social theory and social history, primarily to the reflections upon the history of knowledge and worldviews, and this is quite clear, to research on traditions and ideologies, and to investigations on the internal articulations and hierarchy searching of the middle classes. And here came to my mind the concepts of powerful knowledge and knowledge of powerful, somehow coined by Michael Young into 2004, but officially published in 2007. And this quite would be also somehow one concepts that could be useful in this discussion we are taking right here. The concept of segmentation takes also on meaning a more complex and it should be faced as a complex and interpretative device for educational systems, structure, development, and importance. But here we said that segmentation first refers to internal structures of secondary schools or secondary tracks. This means that when we're talking about segmentation, we are talking from the we are dealing with the internal perspective of the systems, and maybe it's the internal actors of the education system that have they are playing the most important role. When we're talking about systematization, maybe we're listening to the voice of the state and the political decisions. But when talking about segmentation, it's a more internal perspective. And thus, of course, the relationship between curriculum, social composition of the student, of their student recruitments, and relation between social and education hierarchies, even in a vertical or a horizontal perspective. Segmentation should also be faced as a form to distinguish hierarchies inside what we have talked to the moment as middle classes. Because middle classes, they are not a single or a sole body. They are different middle classes. So it's very important to have this idea also. And the third idea that I highlight from Tanner revision of the segmentation concept, it's the segmentation refers to the structure and the function of knowledge in society, and the difference between modern and traditional beliefs, and also to the divergence in significance. What does knowledge mean for different classes or different occupations? And Latin comes, but also to legitimation of educational structures from the internal, from the internal space of the system, but also to shape self-images for different social strata. They don't see themselves in the same way when they are dealing or acting inside the system. And also to shape the hierarchies of prestige and also the cultural patterns of interpretation. And of course, it entails explaining claims in education, social structure, and knowledge systems. To finish, let me highlight that a reading of the contributions to the volume makes clear an underlying theoretical idea about educational and social change. is that school reflects the fact that its particular characteristics are made possible by the division of power and the influence within society, and that at the same time, the status and the prestige hierarchies of middle class life are created and sustained by educational systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. So, questions to Luis? Everybody's has been.
This is Luis' effect on the audience.
So, review your notes and felicitas.
Thank you, Liz, for your presentation and all the input, notions, authors, bibliography. Yeah, I have two things. The first one is that this idea of adding other categories such as school culture, school form, and so I think that Vignau's work in 2002, that's what kind of he does. He puts all this together. So maybe what we could do is also reread the way in which Vignau puts all these categories together and see if we could add other categories as you are proposing or not, because he kind of provides this idea. And I find it interesting this distinction that you made between systematization, I would say as more as a like the state sphere, and segmentation more probably, yeah, you said more connected to like the internal actions or from the education system. I'm not so sure if they are separate spheres, because segmentation is also produced by state regulations. For example, when you create a tract with a defined curricula, and that's the state that is doing it. So I'm not so, I understand the idea of these two spheres, but I don't know if they correspond, one corresponds to the state and the other to like these internal forces. That's not so clear to me. But I like the idea of connecting these two. That is the issue of the book, how segmentation and systematization connect. I and the critics agree that it cannot be considered separately. I think that's true, some harmony in one of these points. So maybe we can see segmentation mainly as an effect of the way systematization takes place. I don't know, maybe they are connected in that way. From Ringer and Mueller's perspective, the way systematization took place is connected to the preservation of some status and prestige in classes. So to do that, the result is a segmented system. I don't know, I'm thinking out loud, but it's a reaction to what you proposed in this differentiation between the state and the internal forces. And I think Vignau calls them internal forces, actually.
Yeah, thank you for your remarks and questions, please. Yes, I didn't go to Vignau Frago or even Escolano Benito. There was no room and I was running, but yes, it's quite relevant. It's curious because sometimes namely when I was reading Mueller and Ringer, different chapters, they were talking about segmentation and also systematization, and they balance between these two concepts in a very smooth way somehow. but they established the limits. But in my opinion, I think it's curious because, for instance, Müller suggests also that the wide diffusion of the gymnasium throughout Germany from the mid 19th century onwards, he said, result primarily from the interests of bureaucrats, officers, pastors, and teachers, as Tony posed it. It's curious. It was not a decision, a top-down decision. It was also somehow a bottom-up one. Oh, here we have our interests. Because why, and our interest is to prepare ourselves to reach the university the best as possible. So this and this is what, systematization or segmentation. And curiously, it was Müller that touched this topic when he was talking about systematization. But it could also be somehow a part of this segmentation concept. Yes, and yes, I think the dialogue should be between these concepts. It will be actually it will be make more rich. It will make our reflection more richer, or more and more in-depth one. And I think the school culture and school form and grammar of schooling, I think they are very powerful concepts to embed, not on the top, but also to dialogue with these other two concepts we're dealing with. Somehow, systematization and segmentation could be somehow the big scenario. And in front of it, or and on top of it, or in front of it, if we have a picture of a theater, we can also play with other concepts in order to make our reflection more dense. And of course, also with the concept of powerful knowledge and knowledge of powerful, from Michael Young, but also the codes coined, the classification codes coined by Basil Bernstein, because at the beginning it was interesting because Ringer wrote that the habits, he didn't spoke about codes, not languages, but talk about the forms of schooling. And this is quite relevant. I didn't explore so well this idea of school forms.
Okay. Is there any question from the public? I don't see. More questions from the table?
Luis, por favor, un poco más fuerte.
Un poco más fuerte.
Oh. Yes, Gabriel, I'm trying, but I am a little weak. Just 3 hours of sleep, and this is not the best of my days. I'm sorry, but I will try to speak.
He's a very polite. You are very polite.
There was a question from Marisa Vitar and to all of us, and we haven't checked it.
Congratulations to you in your opinion, the presentation.
If in our opinion,
yes,
the studies on the education systems lost importance in current debates on the history of education.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's why we are here.
Absolutely. It's an old-fashioned question.
I think we have a comparatives that will brought the system with him, I suppose, because it was but it was. But yes, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was the zeitgeist of the educational research by the time. But I like a lot of this systemic approach and systemic it's a systemic rationale, because it helped me, for instance, to sketch the big scenarios in this interdependence, self-regulation, crisis, and open to other social systems. Talking about education, of course. It's very relevant for me, because I start my career talking about a systemic approach to education, from the, how to say, from the international perspective to the classroom activities. And we have UNESCO has published a relevant book in the 80s about teaching according to a systemic approach, in order to decipher the black boxes.
To open the black box. So thank you very much, Luis.
Okay.
So we continue. We are in time, only 10 minutes late. So we have now my colleague Carlos Martinez Valle from the Complutense University of Madrid, who was working in Germany with this river, and who told me that he had 2 dinners with Ringer. So he has been with the staff. So please give us some gossips about. No puedes, no tienes que ir, vete a la carpeta. So sorry for the delay. So we continue with the presentation of Carlos Martinez Valle from the UCM. Carlos, thank you for coming, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you to you, Tony, for organizing that, and thank you, all of you, for being there. I think I'm not dealing with exactly with the concept, the central concept of the book, but with more, but rather with the some assumptions about the power of comparison for making history, and which is the issue or the problem that Jürgen Schriba and Klaus Harney deal with in his comments to the whole research program or project. If I have to answer the question posed previously by an attendant, if the system research is so important in history of education, I think that no, and it is because of the loss of importance of social history. But the same problem is happening also in comparison, and this is the problem I'm dealing about here, because even within comparison, the problematization of systems have suffered a decline in interest by the comparatists, and the interest is more directed now, and I was part of this evolution, not the analysis of systems, but rather to make transfer analysis, which is one of the biggest issues in comparatism. And I myself, I think I'm not, I don't know if I have the qualifications for speaking here, because I'm a historian of ideas myself, and then I made comparison in Berlin, so I'm coming directly from the opposite side, from the enemy, and I'm not so acquainted with the central concepts of the project. What I would like to do here is more to reflect upon the claims of comparison for the importance of comparison for history, the explaining power of comparison, and how about the criticism that Jürgen Schriba and Klaus Harney make to the whole research project, which would be my second part. And the third part is I will try to tell you roughly about how comparativism have debunked itself these claims that they made, or the comparatists made about this explanation powers. So how comparatism itself has debunked these previous claims. And perhaps if I have time, I will deal with other proposals that perhaps could be in Society and Education, Fritzinger maintains that, I quote, equally obvious is the need for the comparative approach. There is simply no other means for arriving at explanations, not just descriptions of change in education. One has to be able to separate the unique characteristics of this or that national system from the features shared by several systems. This kind of discrimination, in which the generality of causes is related to the generality of the effects, is an indispensable step in the construction of adequate explanations. The need for systemic and comparative work is sufficiently great to overcome all objections. Viñao Frago, by his part, he says that, states that the history of literacy, like the history of education in general, only makes sense from a comparative perspective. Consciously or unconsciously, with or without a method, directly or indirectly, it is not possible to make a history of education without making comparative history. And this has been the case since the origin of both. In this book, in his comments, says that, or Hani also, and says that the comparative method is acquiring a new central importance as the most promising way of achieving the analytical separations of the general and the particular and a meaningful historical interpretations demand. No? Strong claims about the importance of comparison for history. Claims that I'm not able to accept fully. I think there are a lot of different histories, and they have all its value, and they can be have explanation power without resorting to the comparison. And we should know that there are a lot of there's a different ethos in the sense of practices and values conveyed in both activities that are very different. The attention to the detail, the following the sources of that makes a good historians are not part of the ethos of the comparatists. The opposite. No? We need abstract concepts, being very selective, and not in the way that historians are, but rejecting even some parts of our data that doesn't fit into the big scheme. But for analyzing what Hani and Sriva says in the comments, is a weird thing to make a comment on a comment, but I will try to do it. We have to say that both Jürgen and Klaus were really passionate about history, and in the same sense that they say that comparison is could be or had become a central instrument, or a very important instrument for making social history. They accepted, or they proclaimed that history is a fundamental part of comparison, that you can make any sensible comparison without resorting to history. But they consider the whole research project from a comparative perspective. No? And in some of the questions that, for instance, I've heard to Luis, sorry, by the way, for not being able to be attending your presentation earlier. because I had classes, are already enough with the remarks that Tenov makes are repeated also in the work of Hane and in the piece of Jürgen Silva and Klaus Hane. For instance, the need to attend to the need to pay attention to the endogenous forces or variables, the need to interconnect in a more general conception of the system. So, so sorry if I'm repeating what you presented first, but for his comment, Jürgen and Klaus, I can analytically separate two different sort of comments. One referring to the comparison as such, and the others more issue-related problems that they saw in the research project and in the book. I will try to translate it to more accessible words. Sometimes when you translate from German, this is a systematic problem. You have to get rid of lots of words. For being precise, in other, at least in Spanish, you have to get rid of the half of the, because they're repeating, no, is sort of Spanish or Japanese, that they repeat the things into different writings, no? In German, sometimes so. So I will try to translate it. I don't know if successfully. They say in the critique that we need to separate the comparison as a heuristic, basic knowledge instrument, which is which allows us to single out things, just comparing the similarities and differences, and this is a basic intellectual tool of an inductive sort, not from the scientific understanding of comparison as a method, which has a more clear deductive character. In this much more sophisticated procedure, the comparison try to test hypothetically adopted connections between various abstract defined variables as postulated in clarifying theories or models. And they explicitly mention the relationships between degrees, qualification, prices, the differentiation of the formula. The comparison design and practice is therefore guided by theories and hypotheses that deploy hypothetically adopted connections between variables as covariant batteries of phenomena identified at different levels of analysis. The level of abstraction required for comparative research on sets of covariants in different cultural contexts and different levels of analysis require not the comparison of single or concrete constructs, but rather the comparison of relationships. No, in a higher degree of abstraction. I tried, if I have to visualize that in some way, I think Jürgen used this also. He used these images by Alexander von Humboldt, the intelligent brother of both. The intelligent one. And the funniest one. No, for explaining in some sort how this classical way of understanding comparison act. This is put in different context with a single problem through different context and analyzing a problem that is multifaceted, or which consists of multiple variables for getting a more abstract an abstract result that encompasses all the problems in more or less causal relations. No, in this sense, it is actually, as the image almost conveys, an ecological understanding of the problem. And this ecological understanding of the problem will lead to the new proposals in comparison. For doing that, there is a difference between this proposal or this image in Alexander von Humboldt and the proposal of Jürgen and Klaus, which is that it is theory which leads the research, not the analysis of the cases. The cases, you use the cases for test the theory. Mm-hmm. So this is very important. And one of the critiques of the text of the book is that they actually use as a rule one single theory, which is Bourdieu's reproduction, and they tend to minimize, and therefore they tend to minimize the differences between different countries, the different settings, for pressing all of them towards the to this pre-assumption that for accepting the Bourdieu's theory, instead of analyzing, for instance, the differences, which were in this case what was more interesting, for continuing or for provoking more historical analysis and create a more developed theory. This sort of analysis, theoretically based and hypothetically deployed analysis, which are followed by the searching for the different cases that can or cannot or that test the theory, needs a couple of things. This, first of all, a sort of ecological understanding of the problem. In his case, they say that one of the biggest problems is that they don't consider the system as such, and that they don't have a theory of a solid theory of system, no, a systemic theory, and it requires the development of sophisticated testing instrument of an almost sociological character. And this is, they are very critical with the text, but in some points they said that these are very good work, concretely or more specifically when talking about inclusivity, the indicators of inclusivity and progressivity of Ringer. Tony, please cut me when you feel it, okay?
No worry.
No, which are statistically very advanced. So in this sense, they conceive comparison as a meta method. The comparison use a lot of different methods, qualitative, quantitative, whatever, for doing their work. However, in the text, they point to another version of comparison, which could be the most classical understanding of comparison, which is Durkheim's and Stuart Mill, that have less theoretical requirements, in which you, following a problem, you don't need necessarily to search for a theory, but to have to search for different cases for creating some sort of what we can call middle range theory or grounded theory. No, they don't tell it but they pointed when they speak about Durkheim and so on, they are telling that, and in this sense, the methods of Ramil or Durkheim are more alike with the traditional practice of historians, because, for instance, the Stuart Mill method of difference is a trans-historical analysis, period. For more concrete problems that they see in the research program, I have mentioned already the thing that they pressed all the cases against the theory of Bourdieu's social reproduction. They don't mention it, but it's almost say that Germany is a bad case for testing Bourdieu's theory, because in Germany there was a relative big affluence of middle classes into the university, which provoked a lot of problems about academic proletarians. No? They said, secondly, that the hypothesis, the explaining theory, hypothesis of explaining variables that in this case, that Müller uses too variegated of different different degrees of generality. So, for instance, here, social reproduction of Bourdieu, the crisis and saturation of the labor market, economical crisis, and this is against the attempt of comparison, of comparativism, of reducing variables to those that are the most important. No, they say actually that they are acting as historians and not exactly as a comparatives, in which, I don't know, for instance, for a comparison, the paramount work of comparison could be Barrington-Moose, no, and here Barrington reduces to two different agents, the different political systems, no? The activities of two different actors, the peasants, land workers, and the oligarchy. You know, it reduces the differences between fascism, democracy, and so on and so forth. Not the activities. And Hani and Schreiber are saying that this is what actually comparison is, to reduce at the maximum the variables that explain that to those that are really. Okay. So he said that they are that in the book there is an ad hoc research, no, for pressing the theory of Bourdieu, and that if we have to escape that, we need to create or to pay attention to theories of social system, and in particular of education systems. This allows us to separate theory and facts, and theory and the concepts used by the agents. They criticize the same use of system in the work, and this is very important because they say that there is no system. Until the creation in the late 19th century, there was not compulsory, not everybody was attending. And in this lack of understanding of the whole as a system, so they pose problems of periodization that are very important. And for instance, they say that this allows us, this lack of understanding of a system creates some problems, for instance, between the relationships of the different concepts, with what you were saying previously, more or less, and for instance, which is very clear in the, for instance, extension of educational systems or social reproduction in social systems, in educational systems, when the basis, for instance, in Spain, no, we have this low-cost educational system you mentioned, and yeah, we needn't any other thing because the main problem was educational exclusion. So most of the people were out of the system at all. You don't need a segmentation. You don't need segregation. Most of the people were out of the system. No? For instance, this is my interest also in considering the work of Sir Laurie Morant and the Fabians in education and the creation of welfare state. So they repeat, they don't say, we don't know when the system is formed. They say that it's only when it's really become universal. And we need to take in for as a solution, they tell that perhaps the Luhmann conception of the system or Luhmann theory would be a good departing point. I tell you, Luhmann is, I can't understand it, but this is another problem. But what Luhmann makes very well is a new understanding of system in which they are not as mere summatorium of different parts. No, that is what Jürgen and Hani says, that they are doing. They are analyzing the composition and recompositions of parts of the system. Well, the new proposals, or the banking from the comparison theory. The same comparativists have debunked all of these supposed power of the comparison for history, because, for instance, because of the problem, Galton's problem. Galton's problem when there is globalization and with generalization of ideas, the introduction of new models, of new structures are not consistent with any other things that can explain that, but the opinions, the mere will of actors, and therefore you can't explain anything but that the decision of these actors. This Galton problem has supposed a collapse of almost of the comparative field, and there are some new ideas about that, which would be, for instance, to retreat to the proposals of the classical comparison, to make it not depending from theory, but as an instrument for creating theory and evolve little by little. There is a proposal by Jürgen Riva about, for instance, to create a new sort of comparison based on chaos theory, because what we know is that, for instance, small variables that are apparently unimportant there is no linear causal way of explanation, but the world is very complicated, and small causes have big effects, or no, and big causes have perhaps no effects, and to introduce a more chaotic, whatever, ways of understanding comparison and the world.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for your contribution, and we have still some minutes to questions. Why do you leave?
Sorry, I was.
So, is there any question for Carlos? In the chat. The comparison is based on theorization. Does this mean that it is not useful to compare? There is always the need to compare similar social conditions. Do we come to the opinion that there are no similar situations? That's for you, Carlos.
as I said that there are a lot of different ways of making history. It is probably so that there is a lot of different ways of making comparison. What they are proposing is a very, what we can call high comparison, no, based on theory and so on. In some sense, it was also the program posed by the already classical thinkers of the sociology. But if we think in sociology, they are making other things. They are not making comparison either. They are making case studies based on qualitative methods, correlations, and they are sometimes trying to test some theory, but not always. They are most interested sometimes in problems. So we have the same problems about the feasibility of these big these big programs of comparison, because they are very difficult. You have to be something special as Barrington Moore for doing that. I don't know. To have a mind, even if we consider, for instance, other, I'm more acquainted with the political comparison in political history. So if you consider ¿cómo se llama esta? Social revolutions.
One?
Social revolutions, ¿cómo se llama?
Skophold.
No, Frida Skophold. She's not doing that. She's analyzing. She actually takes ad hoc the three biggest revolutions, and she studied it for understanding which are the common terms. No. And making theory out of that in a very inductive way. So even the people that are more trained in the relations between that have a strong sociological background, that have and they're genius, they are not doing that. They are not following theory, because this is another problem. We don't have general theories. This is, in my opinion. No, but general theories have lost the appeal, and not only the appeal, because they are sometimes, we are not producing. The academic world is not producing. That is the reason why we are doing other things. We are stupid people, we do intellectual history. No? For me, these days.
But I
spoke only about me.
I was curious about the picture you present us, but you did not explain so well. Could you do it?
Oh my goodness. Thank you for telling me that I didn't do anything good.
I'm sorry, I think that
close it,
I
close.
I'm sorry.
Close y no guardes. No guardes. Okay.
No, está fuera ya.
No,
well, it depicts three.
I can hope that for you.
Three mountain ranges. This is by Alexander von Humboldt, and he traveled all around the world, no? And
no, it was in Descargas. It was in Descargas. You must go to Descargas. Okay.
And it depicts the different botanical constructions on different parts of the world. One in Lapland, I think, the other in the Alps, and the other in the Chimborazo, in the Andes. And what he's trying to convey is a sort of common, to say that, how the botanical structure is conforms to different to latitude and latitude.
Longitude.
Latitude is the north-south.
Yeah,
no?
yes.
North-south, and altitude in the high mountains and the degree of highness, no, of the mountains. How these botanical conformations developed or are present in different contexts. So for doing that, he has to consider altitude, latitude, but also sun, insolation. No, it is an understanding of the botanical of the similarities between different botanical positions according to many different variables that that need an almost ecological understanding of the whole for making the comparison. No, it's not. Yeah. So all these things together, attitude. Yeah, it's better this way.
Yeah,
Some better.
because it was the only picture you presented, and I was curious, but
I didn't have the time for making a PowerPoint, and I'm against PowerPoint. Sorry.
You have mentioned a lot of very interesting things because you are very clever, but I think that maybe, I don't know, what do you think? Maybe the problem with this river is that, well, it's like Luhmann for me. I've never understood what this meant, no? But this radical separation between this idea of that we have to separate the details of the cases from the theory. I think it's not the objective. Maybe this is wrong, no? This idea that comparison makes separates the details from the theory. Maybe it's better to think that comparison gives a framework to understand the details, no? Which is more sophisticated, maybe, no? Because maybe the question of comparison is that to offer theoretical spaces, middle range theories, when we can understand the plurality of cases. You know?
I don't know if I use the term details. It was my own.
Your own, yes.
Not necessarily Jürgen. I think perhaps I introduce a lot of noise with this. No, the thing is that what he says, or they both say, in my understanding also, is that actually the comparison as a scientific method requires a degree of abstraction that makes unnecessary all of these small details, because they go for the big whale. They are not for fishing sardines, or they're going for the main idea, the values that the variables that can be really explaining. So, and in this way, the efforts of historians and comparators are not similar. We are in the same department usually, and so on, but our work is very different. That was I tried to mention at the very beginning. So, in the same sense, as a comparativist, you don't follow the sources. No, as a historian, you should follow the sources. You should be keeping what sources are telling you. As a comparative, not, because the level of abstraction is much higher.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't know if I.
Yes. Yeah. But I was thinking,
it's always Barrington. It's always Barrington.
Yeah.
No, you say two agents, the interaction in between two agents.
Chuck Tilley, no? Coercion and capital.
Yeah.
It's a very elegant scheme, very fantastic, no? Very elegant, simple, but simple. I mean, you are leaving a lot of detail, but useful.
That is, we comparatives exchange one, and it's a trade-off. What you lose in meaning, in one sort of meaning, you gain in another sort of meaning.
Okay.
But it's a Caribbean, no? It's like Caribbean. You have to choose for one rock to bang your head.
It's not excluding. I mean, in different moments, you need different approaches.
This is what Jürgen doesn't say, but it's also my position. You use one thing for one thing, and
you need the other thing for another thing. I mean, it's not.
For instance, you can use comparison for in an inductive manner for creating more theory, and therefore you have the comparators criticizing you. You need a more thorough and encompassing theory of system if you want to make that properly.
Okay. Perfect. So if you can put again the public, no, dejar de compartir, dale a dejar de compartir.
Mira, tú lo ves, yo no sé.
Dejar de compartir ahí al lado de lo verde, más para la izquierda, Ahí, dejar de compartir. Okay, so we finish here. I will ask to the public to put the cameras just to see them, because we know some of them, but maybe we can recognize us again when we meet again. Doesn't matter if you cannot. Marisa, okay, hello. Panayotis.
Hi to everyone from Athens.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Panayotis.
How is everybody? I didn't know Brian Newton. Okay, so if there is no question, thank you. You would want to do a picture of us?
I can take a picture.
Okay, so if there is no question, we finish here. Thank you very much for coming. And there is another seminar this afternoon at 4 Madrid hour. Thank you for following us, and we meet again in another occasion. Thank you very much.
Budapest.
Wait for the picture.
Thank you.
Thank you also. Bye.
Wait for the picture.
Okay.
Wait.
Bye.
Un saludo a todos.
Gary.
Ponla, Gaby, pon la cámara.
Es que tengo cara de recién operada.
No, vale, perdona, Gaby.
Tengo ahí, pero ya estoy bien. Venga, un saludo. Una pena no veros.